The goal of many writers and video game developers is to create a world that the player cares about, a setting where the player can immerse themselves and fully experience the world in front of them. A place that provides an escape and gives the player something else to worry about other than the chaotic world that we currently live in. A place where, instead of stressing about work, school, or family, the stress comes from trying to avoid the noxious gas of the Sierra Madre or not dying to a legendary bloatfly. Video games provide a unique experience to the user. In other forms of media like movies and books, the viewer or reader usually takes on a spectating role. In games, we take on an active role where the player is typically in control. They're allowed to experience, and sometimes even make, the tough decisions that the main character encounters and face the consequences of their actions. Video games offer the unique experience of what we call gameplay, the specific way in which the player interacts with the game. And unlike the other forms of media that I mentioned, books and movies, some games face a constant clash between the lore, that is, what the game tells you through dialogue and other literary forms, and gameplay, what you, as a player, control and experience. And in most games, this constant clash is unavoidable. While developers can find creative ways to mitigate the impact of these differing aspects, lore and gameplay will always compete. They will always butt heads with one another. I'll provide a quick example to demonstrate this. I think everyone will be able to understand where I'm going with it. I touched on this idea a bit in my Operation Anchorage video a long while ago, so if it sounds familiar, that's probably why. Imagine any on-rails traditional first-person shooter, like Call of Duty for example. Through any lone mission, you're shooting at hundreds of enemies. This portrayal of combat is extremely unrealistic to the lore of the game, especially in the older titles. No side of World War II had some super soldier charging through the front lines, putting down hundreds of combatants in a single battle. But if the game were to adhere to the strict lore, or in this case, historical accuracy of the setting, you'd end up with an extremely difficult and extremely unfun game. Playing first-person shooters is fun. Actually experiencing the worst war in the history of wars is not. Sure, it's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates my point nicely. Gameplay and lore will typically compete. Today, I want to go over some instances in Fallout where gameplay just doesn't match the lore of the game. Times when the lore was nerfed to make the game more fun, and times when gameplay took a hit to better the lore. And don't get me confused, this video isn't about lore breaking or retcon instances in Fallout. It's strictly for times when what we read or are told in the game doesn't match the gameplay. It doesn't match the gameplay mechanics of the game. If you're confused now, I hope after the first example it'll be more clear. Without further ado, let's get started. Radiation. After global nuclear war wiped out much of Earth's civilization, humanity was left with post-apocalyptic fallout. One way or another, be it from leftover byproduct of the nuclear blasts, leaks from fusion-powered automotives, or even landfills filled to the brim with radioactive waste, radiation was now a common threat to the leftovers of humanity. Now, let it be known that I am a nerd. I like science and engineering, but I am by no means an expert, so I'll provide my best summary of how radiation in real life works, augmented by some information from articles on the subject. Because, believe it or not, radiation in the Fallout universe is not like radiation in the real-life universe. I know, shocking. The basic Google definition of radiation is the emission of energy or transmission of energy in the form of waves or particles through space or a material object. The harmful radiation our character accumulates through their fancy radiation meter or Geiger counter is gamma radiation. Gamma rays have the smallest wavelength and are able to pass through the human body, causing DNA and tissue damage. And gamma rays are no joke. The effects of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster are still seen to this day. Radioactive fallout, where the franchise gets its namesake, is the residual radiation particles that fall to the Earth as the result of a nuclear explosion. The usual threat of radioactive fallout depends on the bomb's yield, how tall the explosion was, and the surface conditions of where the bomb was dropped. Lingering radiation from long-lived radioactive isotopes like strontium-90 or cesium-137 could potentially be dangerous to survivors for up to 5 years. This begs the question of, if the bombs dropped over 200 years ago, why is there still radiation in the Commonwealth, Capital Wasteland, and the Mojave? To find this answer, we have to accept a few things about the Fallout universe. 1, it's a science fiction game, a place where our real-world physics aren't applicable in every sense. 2, the introduction of nuclear fission power and eventually nuclear fusion power made it so that every nuclear-powered product had some ability to emit radiation over time. 3, it seems as though radiation in the Fallout universe has become part of the fauna and wildlife in it. Glowing creatures became conduits for radioactive emissions. The glowing sea itself is a radioactive ecosystem brought on by nuclear blasts and radioactive waste in the area. With this overview of radiation in our world and radiation in the Fallout world complete, let's get into the first example of when lore doesn't match the gameplay. It starts with the Ghouls, the mutated humans created from either consistent radiation exposure or nearly instantaneous radiation exposure of a significant amount. The lore surrounding Ghouls is still a bit muddy, to be fair. But consistently throughout the franchise, the protagonist is unable to become a ghoul. When that rad counter hits 1000, it's game over. Even though the lore states that extended radiation exposure means ghoul, even if you keep your radiation exposure at 1 rad per second until you cap it out, there's no shot at becoming a ghoul. And sure, while it could be explained in lore through that mythical ghoul gene theory, let's ignore that, and figure that the more appropriate answer, albeit meta one, is due to gameplay mechanics. The wastes are supposed to be dangerous. They're supposed to be unforgiving, wild, and unpredictable. Providing the player with various hazards that need to be mitigated adds another dimension to the game. The player has to contend with creatures who want to prey on them, people with differing and conflicting motives, and the radiation-plagued environment. If being a ghoul was an option, and having the ability for radiation to heal you, the best min-maxing way of playing the game would be to dunk yourself in a pool of radiation and become a ghoul. Sure, while your charisma might take a hit because you're no longer a smooth skin, charisma is literally the worst special stat across the entire franchise, and the gameplay trade-off of healing from radiation seems much better. It's just one of those cases where gameplay mechanics override the lore. Let's get to some more examples. Enemies. Let's go back to what I said about gameplay hazards being creatures, people, and the environment. Let's take some time to speak about the first item, the creatures, or in a gameplay sense, the enemies of the Fallout universe. While I'm sure there are countless examples of enemies of the waste that break their own lore for the sake of gameplay, I've prepared 3 examples that I think demonstrate the idea of how lore competes with gameplay. The first example being the Tunnelers of the Divide. I remember making my Ulysses' Greatest Fear video about how Ulysses mentions the tunnelers below the divide will be the Mojave's next biggest concern in a few years. I'll play the full quote if I can find it, the actual one, not me just reciting it from the video.
They'll start emerging throughout the Mojave in time. Might be years, probably less. They breed fast, hunt in groups, more than enough to bring down the strongest in the Mojave. Once they draw blood. Seen them tear apart Deathclaws. Deathclaw might get some, but the rest will swarm it, tear it apart, like Denver hounds.
In truth, the tunnelers were one of the things that inspired me to make this video. People in the comments of that previous mentioned video said that Ulysses was blowing smoke and that it's obvious through the game that the tunnelers aren't a big deal. They ain't even that poggers. The reason they don't appear to be these insane pack monsters that can team up and take down Deathclaws, the reason why when you pit 10 tunnelers versus 1 Deathclaw, the Deathclaw still wins, is because of gameplay purposes. If the Tunnelers of the Divide had the correct amount of power in-game as they're described by Ulysses and others, then Fallout New Vegas' Lonesome Road DLC would be quite the significant roadblock. It would be nearly impossible to beat without playing a fully stealth build. In lore, the Tunnelers have spent 200 years mutating, adapting to subterranean conditions underground, and creating tunnels all through the Mojave. After the Courier's accidental nuclear explosion creates the Divide, these humanoid reptilians were exposed to the surface world. While they're currently only a threat to the few inhabitants of the Divide, according to Ulysses, they may eventually pose a bigger threat to the rest of the Mojave. In-game, while they can pose a threat to the Courier due to them hunting in groups, the strength of an individual tunneler in-game isn't anything scary. It's no sentry bot or deathclaw, that's for sure. Games are meant to be enjoyed. They're meant to be fun. If every monster had the amount of power the lore states they have, the game would be a lot less fun. The second example of when lore and gameplay don't meet is the rare case where gameplay is overtuned and compared to the lore. The times when this happens in games are few and far between, as most cases when writers write an enemy to be cannon fodder, they're usually implemented as cannon fodder. The grunts from Halo are like this. They're the lowest rank in the Covenant hierarchy in-game, and they act as such, being, in most cases, super easy to take down. It's rare to have a case when the enemy written in lore is to be a common nuisance, but they end up being incredibly strong. I think the Cazadors from Fallout New Vegas are kinda like this. Created in the labs of the Big Empty, the Cazador is the result of DNA experiments performed by Dr. Boris in 2003. While they used to be confined to the Pepsin DNA splicing lab, they have since expanded their territory into the Mojave. And yes, while it may be the intention of the game designers to make the Cazadors appear weaker than they actually are, the first impression I get from Cazadors is that they'll be similar in strength to a blood bug, or maybe even a stronger bloatfly. What is not expected is a poisonous attack that deals 3 times the damage of a giant rad scorpion over a longer time. You'd really expect a giant frickin' scorpion to dish out more damage than a big wasp, right? The only reason I mention that in-game they're stronger than in lore is because Red Lucy has a dialogue where one of the fights in the Thorn, the underground fighting den in Freeside, is 3 fiends against a group of Cazadors. If Red Lucy thinks that's a fair fight, then I'd figure one Cazador must be relatively easy for the courier to take down, but here I am having to spam anti-venom and stim packs. It's just a reverse instance of the Tunnelers. The Cazadors come off as stronger in-game than they're described in lore. Let's move on to the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme, the true Sigma males of the Fallout universe, the Enclave's Sigma Squad. Described as the highly trained, highly organized elite combat squad, Sigma just doesn't live up to the hype. After the destruction of Raven Rock and the death of Colonel Augustus Autumn, Sigma Squad was ordered by the Enclave High Command to secure and hold the Eastern Enclave's secondary headquarters, the Mobile Base Crawler. There they would train non-stop in preparation for the Brotherhood of Steel's final push to eradicate the faction that represents the remnants of the American government. Made up of 6 of the Enclave's best combatants, each member of Sigma Squad is highly trained with numerous combat missions under their belt. If Sigma Squad can't do it, no one can. Yet, this elite hit squad all share the same stats as a normal Enclave soldier. What's up with that, eh? The strongest, most elite group sent by Enclave High Command themselves are nothing more in-game than just some standard soldiers? These guys are supposed to be the big guns. So it seems just a bit silly to the lore that a teenager from Vault 101 can beat them so easily. To be fair though, all the protagonists in the Fallout games are kind of correct anyway, but it just seems odd, you know? Part of the reason why the protagonists may seem so lore-breaking is because the lore surrounding at least one of the weapons they use doesn't match the actual stats of the weapon. Q35 Matter Modulator. The Q35 Matter Modulator was the product of the stolen Project Semele. The goal of the project was to make a plasma rifle that was easier to carry and manufacture, as the only one on the market at the time was the Winchester Plasma Caster, which was this bulky minigun-esque weapon. Merely a prototype and not intended for actual combat use, the gameplay stats on the weapon are actually sorta cracked, and definitely do not align with the work-in-progress lore that's given to it. The Q35 has twice the rate of fire compared to a standard plasma rifle. The shots have a higher velocity, it loses condition slower, has 50% higher DPS. While it does do 7 less damage per shot, its crits do 15 more damage, it uses 2 less AP and VATS, and to top it all off, it weighs 1 pound less than the normal plasma rifle. And this is just an aside, but it also looks pretty badass. The black and red is definitely a nice look. What's funny to me is that the RepCon terminal describes the weapon as, word for word, not suitable for extended field use. To me, this implies that it should break down quicker, yet the weapon has the second highest item HP of all rifle-type energy weapons. It just lasts forever. This disconnect between gameplay and lore isn't limited to enemies and weapons, but also the armor. And not just any armor either, but the most iconic armor of the franchise. Power armor. Typically some of the strongest armor in the game, the developers of the game have tried different ways to limit the access to the armor early in the game. The 2 I want to talk about are the power armor training perks of Fallout 3 and New Vegas, and the fusion cores of Fallout 4. While both are in-lore explanations of why the protagonist can't use the suit of armor, Either they don't know how to properly use it in the case of power armor training perk, or they don't have the proper supply of power to the frame in the case of the fusion cores. In real life, both serve as gameplay mechanics to stop the player from having too much power early on. Where the gameplay and lore doesn't match up is the inconsistency between the two games. In Fallout 3, there is no shot of anyone who wasn't Enclave, Brotherhood, or Outcast wearing power armor. This was because you had to belong to one of these three factions in order to receive the proper training for the metal suit. You had to learn how to engage the suit's functions and relax your muscles in order to make the suit work for you. And there were only a few people who could teach this. In-game Paladin Gunny and assumedly one of the outcasts at the VSS building in Fallout 3 can teach the Lone Wanderer, and Elder McNamara, Elder Hardin, Daisy, or Orion Marino in New Vegas can teach the Courier. People needed proper training to be able to use these suits. Yet, in Fallout 4 you can find gunners and raiders in the armor, and even command your companions to enter their own suit. These people didn't receive proper training. What the heck? Do you know how far I had to get in the Fallout 3 story before I could rock out in my own T-45? Well, actually you do get the perk after Operation Anchorage, so I was really just like level 5 rocking out in the winterized T-51B instead. Whatever. And then the reversal of that, in past games there is no mention of a fusion core to power the suit. Everyone just rocks it 24/7. While the word power in powered armor already implies just how the suit works, there is never mention of worries about running out of power or concerns about conserving the cores. It was just fine to wear it all the time. Now this isn't some retcon rant either, both cases are fine, and the way power armor is portrayed in Fallout 4 and 76 is probably closer to the true lore than past games. It's just past games never had the technical capabilities to provide lore-accurate armor. The lore in those games take a hit because of gameplay, or maybe actually engine limitations. Now this all may seem a bit pointless and you're going to say, who cares about this? And the answer to that is, I care. And yes, it is a bit silly. But it's just one of those tiny cases where gameplay, that is the idea of introducing a mechanic to slow player progression and power, differs from what we're told in-game. So what matters most? I think it should be quite obvious by now my feelings on the relationship between gameplay and lore. To be clear, gameplay 99.99% of the time should be at the forefront, and it just goes back to the type of media, video games. Most of the time people are playing games because they want to be in control and experience the actions and consequences of their character that they are playing. Video games are unique in that sense. Unlike movies or books, the person consuming the media is in control. And so rather than having the player be the victim of the tedious parts of lore and realism, the lore should be modified around fun and engaging gameplay. This leads to developers having to find ways to make the gameplay fun while also crafting a compelling world. Because, at the end of the day, most people will play a game that is fun regardless of the world that it's set in. And that's okay. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree? Should gameplay be more important than lore? Should the lore of the world take a back seat to gameplay? Anyway, this is probably my least Fallout-y Fallout video. Let me know if this is something you enjoyed. Thanks for listening. If you liked the video, be sure to share and subscribe. Have a good rest of your day. Cheers.
I've thought about this day for a long time. Dreamed about it, really. Though I never thought I'd see that dream come true. Now that it has, I'm left with a question that I don't know the answer to. What happens next?
Well, you're free now. You can do anything you want.
Freedom. I never appreciated that word as much as I do right now.